Hello, I'm Arthur Bliss, and this video contains 18 red pills for you. The term red pill refers to a scene in The Matrix where the protagonist Neo is given the option to take the red pill and continue discovering the uncomfortable hidden reality, or to take the blue pill and forget all about it. The challenge is to watch all 18 without getting triggered by cognitive dissonance or offended indoctrination, considering the evidence without taking the blue pill back to the simplistic perspective most people live in daily. Whatever your political or cultural background, I think you'll actually find it quite difficult to evaluate these claims objectively. While I believe all of these red pills are 100% true, I'm not asking you to agree with me, just to consider them calmly, critically, and with an open mind. If you are offended or disagree with what's put forth, I hope that you will express your views through commentary or your own video rather than simply trying to censor the views articulated here. Such intellectual suppression is petty and cowardly, and a refuge of those who have weak or non-existent arguments against what challenges their presumptions. I'm sure you're better than that. Be assured that if you can convince me that I'm wrong, I'll happily admit it. My goal is simply discovering real truth, not any political agenda or claim to inerrancy. If you can educate me further, please do so. If you find the Red Pills Challenge interesting, please share it, whether here or in another venue. This video is released with a Creative Commons license, allowing you to freely download, share, modify, and reuse its content. No permission is required. Ready? Let's start. Red pill number 1. You are your parents. There's nothing more important in determining what you are and who you become than your genetics. By genetics, I mean all biologically heritable traits, whether their mechanism is understood or not, including epigenetic phenomena. These form your nature, which is both an immediate truth and a logistical flow. Who you are at this instant is extremely proximate to who you were yesterday, even though your spatial existence is entirely transformed and many physical molecules in your body have been altered or replaced. 7 years ago, your body was almost entirely different material, but still was very proximate to your nature today. Your nature is both continuous and conforming, much like water, and its identity is kept intact precisely by its adaptability. Although your physical existence is different now from how it was 7 years ago, you don't think of yourself as a completely different life form from who you were 7 years ago. But consider the living material of your parents mixed together to form you without any death or gap between their lives and yours. In other words, your parents are living on through you, as are your grandparents, great-grandparents, and so on. And if you have kids, you will continue to live past your own death. Now, obviously, your genetic material is slightly different from your parents, but that doesn't mean you're not the same life form. Right now, your body contains many cells with genetic material different from most of your other cells, due of course to various DNA mutators, but also epigenetic changes that occur throughout life. What's even more dramatic is that you also contain the living cells directly from your mother due to fetal microchimerism. This fetal microchimerism is a two-way street, with your mother carrying living cells from all of the children she's had, even ones that were not born alive. In addition, women carry living cells transmitted from the semen of past sexual partners. Frankly, we don't yet know the full extent of microchimerism and how diverse our genetic ecosystems really are, but it is clear that all of us have living, renewing cells from others, at least from our mothers. Perhaps you say that what really distinguishes you from your parents is your cognitive experience. Perceptual experience is effectively instantaneous sensation, and the integration of that experience into our minds occurs through conceptualization. Concepts, whether gained through direct perception, deduced, or otherwise formed, are mutable and communicable. We don't need to pass the perceptual experience per se genetically, and can't as we don't store that. Instead, we pass the concept, which is efficient and well-suited towards rapid adaptation. Conceptual inheritance is exactly what culture does, starting in normal circumstances with your parents. So even if you believe that your culture is your life, then your life still is a direct continuation of your parents' lives, as you've likely inherited their culture. Red pill number 2. Women are much more important than men. Not only are your mom's cells forever living inside you, but the bulk of your genetic basis is from your mother, including all of your mitochondrial DNA. Your mother literally carried you in her body for around 10 months, then gave birth to you, and ideally nursed you for a long time afterwards. Your mother tongue was taught to you by your mother, and the first years of your life were largely defined by interactions with your mother. There is no role more influential on your genetic and cultural character than that of your mother. Human mothers are the world's greatest conduits of knowledge and culture from one life to the next. Human gestation, childbirth, and child rearing are extremely difficult relative to other species. The reward for protecting and loving vulnerable human infants is the world's greatest capacity for intelligence and cultural transmission. The sacrifices necessary to raise human children define femininity, and more broadly, humanity. Women are the fundamental blueprint of human life, as is observable in morphology. The male is differentiated precisely along lines that serve the female's central parental role. Complementing the inward nurturing energy of femininity, masculinity is outwardly focused and expends itself to increase its force. Women are the spirit of renewing life, while men are the spirit of powerful death. Together, the terminal maximum and the gathering root form the composite organism of humanity, but the root is of clearly higher importance. For the same reason, the mother understands her children to be of greater importance than herself. Everything about our existence, including death, is correctly prioritized according to its honoring the central impulse of life, regeneration. Any man who does not understand the greater importance of women, or any woman who, like the feminists, want to assume masculinity, has disordered and dishonored both sexes. Red pill number 3. Eurasians are distinct from other racial populations. Currently, the most popular theory of human origin is known as the out-of-Africa theory, and it posits that all modern humans evolved in Africa and dispersed to other parts of the world around 50,000 years ago. This theory became popular quite recently in an academic environment that explicitly denied the importance of racial differences and was eager to prove the equality and even supremacy of the black racial history. This desire to prove racial equality is a common insecurity of Western egalitarians, given the tremendously more advanced civilizations of Eurasia compared with sub-Saharan African cultures. The hard evidence supporting out of Africa is very questionable, and much of it has been challenged since its discovery. One of the theory's founders, Christopher Stringer, has recently expressed considerable doubts about the theory. Meanwhile, in the East, and especially China, work has continued to support a much more plausible multi-regional foundation. Numerous anatomically modern fossils, much older than those consistent with the out-of-Africa diaspora, have been found in Western Asia and elsewhere. The Neanderthal genetic signal found in European and Asian people, but not sub-Saharan Africans, provides an additional clue. As David Reich, the prominent Harvard geneticist who's often quoted in stories suggesting African humans mated with Neanderthals to explain the signal, notes in his paper on the subject that it is also possible that there is an older common ancestor of both Eurasian humans and Neanderthals. This very ancient Eurasian ancestor, perhaps Homo heidelbergensis, would suggest a much older separation between the Eurasian and sub-Saharan African populations than the out-of-Africa theory posits. From simple observation, one notes that the Eurasian subpopulations have tremendous variety within themselves, yet nowhere do we observe distinctly Negroid genetic traits among any population unlikely to have recently hybridized, such as in North Africa. Surely, a common African ancestor would leave many telltale vestigial signs somewhere in their varied Eurasian descendants. Yet obviously that is not the case. The out-of-Africa theory, like the insistence that civilization started at the biblical city of Jericho, is extremely questionable, especially given the agendas of those advancing it. What has become clear is that Eurasians share a common ancestor of relatively recent heritage, and this migratory ancestor evolved and mixed with various indigenous populations, but was markedly different from the sub-Saharan and Oceanian populations. Red pill number 4. Normalcy exists and it is good. Xenophobia is the rule of nature, and every living creature instinctively obeys it. It is only by overcoming our predisposition to instinctual normalcy that we permit, accept, and even adore strangeness. For humans, what is normal is multi-generational societies of monogamous, heterosexual families centered around child-rearing. Men are chiefly responsible for external matters, and women are chiefly responsible for internal matters. This is the norm and has occurred basically everywhere. This doesn't mean that some tribe somewhere hasn't experimented with other things, but that doesn't change what is normal. The idea of a person being homosexual was extremely rare throughout history. This is not because people never had homosexual encounters. They did on occasion in many societies. But whether it was due to sexual desperation, opportunism, or deviancy, it didn't change what was normal, even for that person. All people are fundamentally designed around their own regeneration through reproduction. It's the prime imperative of life. It's normal to everyone, regardless of whether that person has experimented in whatever way with things outside of the norm. The concept of normal is very, very important. Yes, we can be indoctrinated to believe that gender is a social construct, that people can marry horses, or that polygamous societies raising children are normal or preferable. But that would be untrue, and the human normal in most things, even if it is lost to our indoctrinated instincts, is clearly visible in 99% of historical culture. Red pill number 5. You're probably not normal, and that's good too. The very fact that you're watching this video suggests that you're stepping out of what the masses do. The masses are sheep-like. Most people never have a significantly original idea in their entire life. They do not question and they do not think in a philosophical way. It is not because they lack intelligence in a raw sense of the word. They can certainly learn and perform sophisticated activities, but their learning is mimetic, imitating complacently what they have judged to be the culturally normal behavior. Propaganda exploits the simple fact through a multitude of techniques to convince people that the normal has shifted to something and they better follow suit. The trait of normalcy in the masses is just as it should be, as again it is the biological integrity of society. After all, a society full of navel-gazers, inventors, and philosophers cannot function by itself. But normalcy is not all a society needs. A society also must be able to adapt, create, evolve, and transcend. A small segment of the population is given that role by nature. In a healthy society, they serve as advisors to the rulers, as luminaries to the scholars, and masters to the artists. In the rare great society, the rulers themselves have a perfected capacity to dream the future themselves. But this is very rare, as the charisma, authority, and skill necessary to lead is often not coupled with the philosopher's imagination. More often, the leader that imagines themselves an inspired reformer damages the people and society. Good advisors and the rare philosopher rulers preserve the societal integrity and change only reciprocally to adapt to nature, preserving the society through change rather than destroying it with change. Thus, the objective of those who can truly think is to serve those who cannot, much like a parent protects and nurtures an infant, albeit one who provides all the strength and substance of society. Red pill number 6. Civilization belongs to the ancient Eurasians. There is a strong body of evidence to support a common Eurasian ancestor that is not only the genetic but also cultural root of civilizations both East and West. The early symbolic expression of this root was exceedingly naturalistic, continuing into the earliest written history of the most ancient Near Eastern, North African, and Chinese cultures. Ancient Sumer, where so far the earliest literature is known, stands out as an example of an early culture centrally based on natural forces, relationships, and patterns. While hunter-gatherer lifestyles certainly experienced their own commune with nature, the framework of natural order so prevalent in the Sumerian and related cultures appears to be, at least in large part, a product of the agrarian culture of livestock domestication and farming. Given agricultural evidence predating Sumerian artifacts by several thousands of years, the Sumerians, who called themselves the black-headed people, and whose cuneiform shares many similarities with early Chinese ideograms, inherited a complex system of astrology, astronomy, astrotheological spirituality, fertility worship, geometric relationships, and seasonal metaphors reflecting a careful study of the natural world. This body of knowledge had great significance for the Sumerians and their descendants, as it held enormous relevance both practically and philosophically for their agrarian society, intimately coupled as it was with natural rhythms. An astonishing amount of these early naturalistic conventions and concepts remain prominent in modern Eurasian culture, having preserved identifiable characteristics over millennia of obscuration and reinvention in calendars, seasonal holidays, and even religious customs. Through an intricate and hotly debated network of migrations, cultural exchanges, conquests, and derivations, this culture, or perhaps whichever culture was its forebear, appears to have spread across Eurasia through the steppes, developing characteristic regional specificity through a number of likely vectors including indigenous traditions and environmental pressures. Later, many people in the Fertile Crescent migrated up into the forests and swamps of the north, taking with them agricultural practices and nature-based spiritual traditions. The exact paths of their migrations are still, and perhaps always will be, uncertain, but the genetic, linguistic, archaeological, and historical evidence gives convincing testament to a vast Near Eastern farmer infusion with the hunter-gatherer indigenous tribes. Disregarded for centuries, the 13th century Icelander Snorri Sturluson's prose Edda resonates anew when he writes that the Trojan ancestor of the Nordic people, Odin, was the deified king of the men of Asia, who were called Aesir. Odin set off from Anatolia and took with him a great following, young and old, men and women, and they took with them many previous things. According to Snorri, these Aesir found themselves marriages within the new country, and some of them for their sons too, and these families became extensive, so that throughout Saxony and from there all over the northern regions it spread so that their language, that of the men of Asia, became the mother tongue over all these lands. It's quite possible that the original culture of these Nordics was Hittite, which ruled the empire that included Troy and spoke an ancient Indo-European language. Remarkably, Homer's Iliad was practically unknown in Europe when the Eddas were written, the faint history of the Trojan War being known almost exclusively from the Ilias Latina, a short medieval Latin primer exercise. Note that the Edda was written in Old Norse. Interestingly, the theory of a common Indo-European language, whose reconstructed Proto-Indo-European radix necessarily includes words related to Near Eastern agriculture, is quite new, only reaching widespread acceptance in the late 19th century. Indeed, the very existence of the Hittites, who were known in Christendom almost exclusively from Deuteronomy, wherein they were marked for genocide by the Israelites, was largely dismissed until Hittite writings found in Anatolian ruins discovered in the 19th century were sufficiently deciphered. This was the kingdom of Kheta known to the Egyptians, but Egypt's own historical texts were silenced from the time of the Edict of Thessalonica until the pioneering Rosetta Stone breakthrough of Jean-François Champollion in 1822. Sumer and Akkad likewise were lost to history and speculated to have never existed until the 19th century, and their cuneiform not fully decoded until the 20th. More secrets remain to be discovered, but we now have ample evidence of the amazing, advanced, and naturalistic Eurasian civilizations that are the heritage of the East and West long before the great Chinese and Greek cultures. Red pill number 7. Climate change massively altered the civilized world. One of the most significant changes in history was the dramatic aridification of the Near East that appears to have begun around 2200 BCE and lasted nearly a century, turning the once luxuriant Fertile Crescent into a largely inhospitable land incapable of supporting agriculture across its expanse. The previously ubiquitous grazing cattle settlements, which we later find among the migrants who headed north and west into Europe amidst the climate shift, no longer have widespread suitable lands, and agriculture increasingly changes to intensive, slave-driven cultivation of grains in the remaining fruitful pockets of rich earth. As resources became more scarce and unevenly distributed, a new harshness stretched over the region like a dark cloud. The climatological shift was ominously accompanied by the transition of the old age of Taurus, the sacred bull of agricultural society, to that of Aries, the ram, sign of war. While the societal significance of astrological events may seem slight or nil to us today, they were considered highly important in all major civilizations of the time. Whatever cosmological connection there may have been or have not been, a new era of war, patriarchy, and oppression quite clearly came into being at this time, mirroring the harshness and privation of the natural environment. Contemporaneous with these climatological changes, the Near Eastern Empire of the Akkadians, successors to the Sumerians and preservers of the Sumerian agrarian culture and values, fell from power and were soon replaced by the martial and despotic Assyrians, who emerged victorious in the brutal arena of the formerly plenteous and generally peaceful Near East. Consider, for instance, that in the old tales of Sumer and Akkad, Ninhursag, also known as Mama, i.e. mother, the Sumerian mother goddess, created the original 7 males and 7 females from the earth's clay and the god of intelligence, her face glad and joyful as she midwifed their birth. She then became their permanent protector, saving them from the flood intended by 2 competing male gods to destroy them for repeatedly overcrowding the world. In gratitude, she was elevated by the other gods as Belet Ili, mistress of the gods. Ninhursag had solved the overpopulation problem by blessing humans with death from old age, and an apparent evil, death, in a natural cycle was shown to be superior to an apparent good, longevity, abstracted from the natural context. But in the new Assyrian mythology, Tiamat, as Ninhursag is called in the Enuma Elish myth, is angered at the murder of her husband Apsu by the new young gods. Tiamat had earlier asked Apsu, who correctly sees them as a threat, to spare the young gods. a war breaks out between the old gods led by Tiamat and the young gods, who are blackmailed by their champion Marduk to place Marduk above all of them if he will lead them to victory. Marduk kills all the opposition in grisly ways, eventually butchering Tiamat and forming heaven and earth from her corpse. He then claims his prize by becoming a fearsome tyrant god, demanding worship above all others lest his wrath be felt. There is also evidence of the climate shift being responsible for the collapse of the Harappan culture in the Indus Valley and the Longshan culture in China. The ancient Egyptian Old Kingdom collapsed contemporaneously with this climate change as drought stopped the crucially important flooding of the Nile for decades. In the following dynasties, a new all-powerful god-king, Amun-Ra, is developed. A dramatic shift to monolatry emerges around Amun-Ra, who creates himself autogamously without any feminine contribution, and who is the merger of Amun, the sky god, and the ram-headed sun god Ra. Compare this to the sky god El and the war god Yah. In the old agrarian society of the Near East, there appears to have been a deep reverence for maternity and fertility, as with the Epic of Gilgamesh, where we learn the hero's nature is 2/3 inherited from his mother. Remember the importance of mother's genetics, and where Enkidu, the savage man in the wild, is tamed and civilized by his desire for the sacred priestess prostitute Shamhat. She uses his attraction to her to draw him from the woods and wild ways into the agrarian society, an event which, despite its tribulations, he blesses her for as he looks back on his life. It is quite likely that the Mesopotamian elevation of chthonic fertility, sexual harmony, and attendant natural cycles derives directly from the even more ancient significance of the Venus figurines that are found continually from the earliest known Cro-Magnon times all the way to the dawn of agriculture. In a physically competitive and brutal environment, men have considerable advantage over women, and militaristic qualities would naturally be highly valued, while the yielding and generous characteristic of maternal care would be of diminished value and even seen as a liability or weakness. It's important to keep in mind that no major ancient civilization is known to be without violence. Utopian ideas of completely pacifist matriarchies or Engelsian polygamous communes follow wholly the utopian etymology. But generally speaking, soldierly virtues during the time prior to the Aridification appear to be oriented primarily as a protection around a vitally treasured and revered maternal and ecological fertility, as opposed to the later focus on conquest, rapine, and internecine dominance. Similarly, we may hypothesize a connection between a generously abundant, verdant, and sustaining environment with a perception of nature as friend, mother, and God, whereas a converse environment of destitution, sterility, and apparent callousness or even sadism could encourage the perception of natural forces as tyrannical and cruel. Indeed, at its most extreme, this perception of nature as punisher and despot could even develop into the view that nature is evil. Further climatological events would roil Eurasia for the next 2,000 years as control flitted from the established tyrants in turbulent cycles. Although the world had entered a more ferocious age, the destructive chaos gave rise to new creative possibilities, often reviving the old zeitgeist during more civil periods. The venerable ideas of the previous agrarian culture were, despite the ascendancy of Ares, not entirely lost and would be preserved like seeds for the next season. But in the meantime, a new ethos developed around the concept of the dread god, a harsh master of his human subjects. Absolute, blind obedience to the omnipotent arch-god became the norm and was ultimately wedded with monotheism, completely denying the legitimacy of any pretender to the throne. Not only dissent, but also inadvertent transgressions of the god's laws were met with terrorization and in some cases genocide. Sophisticated apologetics explained, like an abused victim, that the violence and wrath were actually due to love, and that all good things were exclusively permitted through the god. Relatedly, in the world of privation and subjugation, good became increasingly identical with personal wealth, even after death, as rewards to those who entirely submitted to God. These aspects of the new ideological framework should be, upon consideration, familiar, for they are all to be found throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, as are a multitude of references to predicative ideas from earlier cultures both before and after the climate shift. Indeed, Yahwism has had an immense influence on the modern world due to its particular cultural contribution. Red pill number 8. Judaism is basically evil. Open nearly any book critical of the Bible, and you'll find that nearly all of the criticisms stem from the Old Testament. As the famous atheist Richard Dawkins states, the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction, jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. This reflects perfectly the new sensibilities that dominated the Middle East after the aforementioned climate change and was not unique to the Hebrews, who, like other Canaanite tribes of that time, also preserved elements of the older spirituality. The Jews hold claim to what is likely the world's oldest continuous eugenics code, creating remarkable linearity between the ancient Semites and those of today, despite various genetic infusions as with the Ashkenazi. This continuity is not due primarily to inbreeding, which is hardly unique to the Jews, but rather to the intricate codification of acceptable behavior through the religious texts of the Tanakh, Talmud, etc. This is more complex than just the laws of Jewish marriage. Traditionally, Jews must not only descend from Jewish genetic lineage, but must also adhere to Jewish law. Those who do not behave as Jews according to their captious laws were ejected from the tribe. Jewish culture thus has through more than 100 generations strongly selected for certain traits and reached remarkable stability. To truly comprehend the effect of this evolutionary pressure, one must not only consider the nature, breadth, and specific content of the Judaic teachings, but also the historical role the Jews have played for several thousand years as a people surviving through interactions wholly dependent on the extraction of resources from other self-sustaining host populations. From the most ancient historical times, Jewish life depended on profiting without direct work, whether by professionalism, retailing, lending, slavery, prostitution, or black market enterprise. In the 2005 National Jewish Book Award winner, The Jewish Century, Jewish academic Yuri Slezkin notes that Jews have long occupied the mercurial role along the margins of the Apollonian Western society. He provides considerable evidence for his theory that this is a kind of natural niche when you have a centralized agrarian and honorable majority society, and that it is mirrored by other people elsewhere, such as the Roma, Irish peddlers, and others. This segment provides extra societal services that members of the main society sometimes want but cannot be honorably provided by its own members. This dynamic actually requires that the strangers on the margins maintain their distance from their host culture. Thus, Lezkin says that the Gentile distrust of Jews occurs not because they are unfamiliar with Jews, but precisely because they are familiar with the dangerous, shifty, and yet sometimes very useful culture at their edges. In order to succeed at this trade, they must offer services and goods unavailable in the producer economy. Perhaps the most popularly acceptable type of leverage so achieved is simply having considerable resources at the ready for trade or lending. But this is not a sufficient assurance or even always possible, so Jews have frequently conspired against their competition, their customers, and the rulers of the lands they inhabit in order to secure their necessary advantage. Think of a people who have been conditioned by tremendous genetic pressure, proud traditions, and rigid religious laws. A people who believe that they are literally chosen by God to rule the world and that all other tribes are inferior and may be ethically subjected to crimes. Imagine such a tribe who believe the physical is the only valid truth, who have for thousands of years completely depended on parasitic relationships with other nations, and who have selected on traits of legalistic argumentation, shrewd trickery, and ruthless intolerance. Do you believe that such a population is truly just the same as their hosts, sharing their principles, beliefs, and basic identity? From the Jew's own perspective, they are vastly superior to the Gentile, and can we, if we use their metrics, honestly disagree? Who can be a better Jew than the Jews themselves? This is precisely Slezkin's argument when he concludes that the modern world is really the Jewish world, where we are all trying, often poorly, to emulate and imitate the behavior of Jews, getting rich without direct work, but through cleverness, connections, and conspiracy. To a healthy host culture, it is completely natural and correct to perceive Judaism as evil, for their culture is a dangerous, tempting, and destructive force, however occasionally useful. The most overtly evil form of Judaism is Satanism, which is simply a theatrical variation of the Kabbalistic occultism, with echoes of Sabbatians and Frankists. But it's all just another form of the same old Toldat Yeshu, cursing of centuries past, for the Jews conversely perceive the Gentiles as dangerous, corrupt, and unclean, as evil. The truth is that Jewish laws, so important in their culture, codify a successful strategy of identity and otherness that preserves the professional relationship between Jews and Gentiles. The truth is we will always need the niche of the Jews or the counterpart. All societies must have their Loki, Odysseus, or Coyote. A bit of evil is sometimes necessary to preserve the good. But because our culture has inverted the traditional paradigm and placed schemes above honor, cleverness above hard work, and retailing over farming, we have become deeply corrupted and unhealthy as a culture. Ultimately, this is just as bad for the Jews as well as everyone else, as they depend on the health of the host. Things must get back into balance. Red pill number 9. Christianity is a slave's religion. Eventually the dust settled in a world of tyrants as procession turned to Pisces and its net of caught fish. Stable climes rose deep within despotic empires, and a second wave of derivative philosophy further redeemed the notions of cruel nature by asserting existential suffering was penitence for sins, whether caused by legalistic trespass, insufficient supplication, physical attachment, or innate defect. The most well-known example of this transformation is Christianity, which joined the Roman Empire with Judaism. Judaism was very problematic for the Roman Empire, with the Jewish-Roman wars claiming more than 1 million lives. Judaism, especially in its most militant forms such as the Zealots, was likely the culture with the least willingness to integrate with and respect Roman culture, which was exceptionally accepting of diverse beliefs, customs, and faiths. Similar to the Persian and Macedonian empires, Rome's considerable multicultural tolerance, coupled with powerful control of military and political rule, allowed it to encompass a vast amount of land and divergent cultures. The social and pecuniary cost Rome expected in return for its relatively minor intrusion into the day-to-day affairs of most people was rarely the source of rebellion, especially given the accompanying protection and trade it afforded. Conversely, Second Temple Judaism was intensely exclusive, with its concepts of genetic religious descent, jealous monolatry or monotheism, being the chosen of God, a messianic apocalypse where God violently slaughters many among every other tribe and raises the Jews up as rulers of the entire world, and the exacting requirements of the Mosaic Law. The Jews greatly resented Roman intrusion into what had developed into an extremely uncompromising set of religious demands. Fervent religious intransigence brought about a perhaps unprecedented scale of ideological conflict, quite different from the conventional battle over resources. For although the Jews had repeatedly been ruled by other empires hundreds of years earlier, the rise of increasingly fanatical sects, in combination with Rome's presence, led almost inevitably to violent holy war. Not all Jews were so zealous, and in fact some of their luminaries had a great curiosity and interest in other cultures. In particular, Hellenistic philosophy was held in very high regard by certain key Jews, including the inestimably influential Flavius Josephus, who uncannily parallels the biblical Paul in numerous respects, and Philo of Alexandria, who came from an extremely wealthy family. These Hellenistic Jews rejected the insular exclusivity and militancy of the Zealots and Pharisees, incorporated Greek Platonism, Roman Stoicism, and other influences, and held high sway with Roman emperors. Christianity, whether by accident or deliberate conspiracy, presented an ideal solution to Rome's Jewish question by the time of its rise from a negligible Jewish sect to a popular Roman religion well over 100 years after the claimed death of Christ. Jews were given a dignified and productive path to be assimilated into the Roman Empire, while the most troublesome holdouts would receive their brethren's blame for rejecting the Messiah, and thus causing the siege of Jerusalem as divine retribution. As Jews point out to this day, Jesus frequently contradicts the Torah and fails to fulfill prophecies, most importantly in that the Messiah of their scripture is a David-like warrior king who leads the Jews to victory over all other nations, placing Jews into world rule. This major incompatibility was waved away in the new religion, primarily on the authority of the New Testament, as in the supersession of prior covenants. If a Jew does not accept the autocratic authority of the Christian scriptures, how is he or she to accept such a different Messiah from what was previously expected? Fortunately for the Romans, and in large credit to the elaborate and Talmudical argumentation of Paul, many Jews did eventually become Christians, especially when Christian Rome began persecution of Jews, persecution prominently led by converted Jews. Rome had changed considerably since the time of the Punic Wars, and the old Gentile families of ancient rule were now of less importance than the wealthiest and most powerful foreign politicians. The multiculturalism which was required for stability in Rome's vast reach conflicted with the old racial rules for senatorship. These rules, and even those for becoming emperor, were relaxed, the process starting under the immensely popular Julius Caesar, whose death by betrayal of the Senate, and most importantly Brutus, compare with Judas, closely prefigured the Passion of Christ. The Romans, unlike several other ancient civilizations, did not worship their emperor as a god, but this changed under Caesar, who became the first Roman to be officially deified as Divus Iulius. Just as Jesus brought universalism and a relaxing of Mosaic law to the Jews, so Julius brought liberalizing change to the Romans. Julius's imperial cult remained widespread at and after the purported time of Christ, and its followers were later readily absorbed into Christianity, as were many of those who worshipped Isis, the virginal mother goddess of Horus, Mithra, the Zoroastrian savior Messiah, Sol Invictus, the unconquered, i.e. undying sun god, who Constantine favored until his conversion to Christianity, precipitating the official adoption of Christianity in Rome, and other deities. The basic reason for the easy assimilation of these diverse cults was the inclusion of numerous practices, myths, and ideas from popular religions. For example, the astrotheological implications of a god who is crucified, dies for 3 days, during which the change in which day's light is relatively imperceptible, and then rises into the sky in resurrection on Easter would be clear with so many parallel beliefs formed around solar gods and the spring equinox, just as was the birth date approximately 3 days after the winter solstice, when the sun seems to be reborn in a new cycle of life. The resurrection, immaculate conception, various miracles, Trinity relationships, 12 apostles, and other coincidences between Christianity and previous religions were so overwhelming that several church fathers directly addressed the issue, some suggesting that Satan had put imitators in place to mislead, and others adopting a gentler line that God had placed these types purposefully to prepare non-Jews to accept Christianity. The Roman Empire, despite its eventual disappearance as an open political force, lived on through this hermetic infusion of massive influence and even continues in unbroken succession to this day, an organization whose membership forms the wealthiest and largest in the world with well over 1 billion subjects. This emperor is seen by his subjects as literally being able to decree the omnipotent will of God. You know the Roman Empire in its new clothes as the Roman Catholic Church. And so Christianity, whether divinely or humanly coordinated or both, shrewdly assimilated the Jews into Roman culture, brought all of Rome's divergent religions under a familiar imperial banner, taught a spirituality based on servility and obedience to civil authority, and made universal empire, whether of souls or subjects, the standard context for politics and religion. But more fundamentally, Christianity globally spread the gospel of subjection, a slave's mentality of humble sacrifice and obedience, pacifying the cruel desert lord into a loving but strict Roman pater who required inner discipline more than legalistic adherence. This gospel found peace and purpose in a dark and limited world, channeling life into a moral struggle of supernatural purity against vulgar sin, the natural world now seen as a hostile moral battlefield. In this, we can see the close relation of Christianity with Zoroastrianism, especially through their mystical fusion in Gnosticism. Zoroaster taught of absolute spiritual warfare between the good god Ahura Mazda and the evil god Ahriman. Every human action would be judged according to which side it helped, culminating in eternal reward or eternal damnation. Within Zoroastrianism, as so clear in Gnosticism, is expressed the fundamentally unclean and imperfect character of the natural world and material existence, starkly contrasted with the Platonic perfection of spiritual idealism. Death, decay, dirt, and chaos are all seen as manifestations of the inherent evil of the physical world. This concept of the supernatural versus the natural also permeates Christianity, especially in Pauline scripture, and has been the root of self-denial, mortification, chastity, and other professions of transcendence above the profane flesh. This conception also occurs in later Indian culture, well after the indigenous Harappan were apparently invaded by Indo-Aryans, who brought a spirituality clearly linked to primitive Zoroastrianism. After more than 2 millennia of authoritarian rule, Hinduism became progressively more nature-denying and ascetic, eventually commingling with other philosophies to form a spiritual mission of transcendence from natural existence, freedom from karmic suffering. This was very similar in many respects to Christianity. Indeed, Buddhism appears to have been a direct influence on Christianity, although proto-Gnostic influences may have in fact even earlier influenced Buddhism. Regardless of the pathway, the result, denying the fundamental reality, goodness, and originating character of nature, was to be found spreading rapidly from Central Eurasia by the age of caught fish, which could be thought of as the age of national and theological subjection. All of the accredited Christian apologetics that have attempted to reconcile the Old and New Testaments could not keep out the belief that the cruel, enslaving God of the Tanakh was different from that of the earlier Theos, which, unlike the Azoret Hadibroth, does not demand absolute monotheism. Thus, Christianity repeatedly needed to cleanse the people of their remaining naturalistic beliefs, whether through the slaughter of the early heretics, violent crusades against Saxons, Cathars, and Bogomils, or the Protestant depaganization of Catholicism. While the Jewish scriptures bragged of their violent suppression of other faiths and even genocide of these competitors, there is no convincing evidence of this actually happening in a regionally significant manner. But the central ideology of the jealous, wrathful God who demands absolute and exclusive obedience would be indeed pivotal in the resulting Christian and later Islamic religions. The zeal of messianic holy war that was the root of Jewish-Roman conflict would become tremendously enlarged once it had the full power of a well-organized 50 million strong empire behind it. The utility and popularity of Christianity well proven, and the canonical scriptures carefully established under Constantine, what remained was to stop the persistent criticisms of the historicity, originality, and spiritual truth of the amalgamate religion and put all of Rome under its sign. Shortly after the Edict of Thessalonica was enacted in 380 Common Era, Emperor Theodosius I decreed paganism from paganus of rural culture in reference to the spiritual traditions far from the Christianized urban centers illegal. The much exaggerated Roman persecution of Christians, which is primarily attested to by later Christian writers, indisputably pales in comparison to the oppression non-Christians would experience in the years to come, including the death of millions of heretics and the forced conversion of countless more. Pagan temples were almost immediately closed and many destroyed throughout the empire, including in the home of the famed Library of Alexandria, largest storehouse of ancient knowledge in the world. According to the 5th century church historian Socrates of Constantinople, the library's crucial collection of holy texts at the Serapeum was deliberately destroyed by the Christian authorities, the remnants further purged under Muslim Caliph Umar some 250 years later. Throughout the empire, the insights of the past were erased, and a dark age of historical ignorance dimmed the land. Red pill number 10. The Enlightenment is just repackaged Christianity minus God. Christian suppression of interdicted beliefs would continue its long, bloody history all the way into the present day. The Renaissance broadening of minds would be answered with the Inquisition, which would later be expanded into attacks on the Reformation. Religious war would decimate Europe in the most destructive European wars until the 20th century. Protestantism, though ignited by fiery independence from Rome, would itself become a vehicle for some of the most radical fanaticism, as Old Testament mores of intolerance and cruelty came back into vogue over meeker New Testament virtues. The environment of religious censorship remains dominant in Western society, though it has been widely reshaped into new cults, many just as intolerant as past ones. Though modern biases can make saying such taboo, the same absolutism, nature denial, and parochialism can be found in facets of numerous modern creeds, including nationalism, humanism, democracy, liberalism, capitalism, and sundry expressions of authoritarianism from the campus to the podium to the barracks. Even those things which seem most apt to lead us to an honest love of nature, such as science, have become greatly ideologically distorted and corrupted by the delusional schism between ideal truth and nature. Nature had perhaps always been the ancient source of spiritual symbolism, and as nature turned sour, the gods became cruel and tyrannical, mirroring the social and ecological reality of the time. Once the chaos of this transformation had finished taking place, the sanctuary available in this new world of slaves and vassals was not to be found here in the reality of life and nature, but only in the afterlife, in nirvana, in abstract ideals ultimately perfected by their total disconnection from natural existence. Civilization transformed first from nature worshipping to nature fearing and then to nature denying. But what essential validity do gods have when they are mere proxies for abstract virtues? Why not dispense with gods, those contaminating vestiges of materia natura, and wholly embrace purely intellectual concepts? In this we find the rise of a modernity, the complete detachment of the intellectual and physical, and hence the severing of spirituality. It is the basic materialistic philosophy, claiming that the physical world is all that exists and all that matters. Our life is purely mechanical, beginning and ending with our corporeal existence. Good and evil can only therefore be real in physical terms, qualities of efficiency towards or away from sensual or emotional pleasure, thus the unwavering religious focus on behavior. By denying all existence beyond the physical, materialism is ultimately an atheistic and nihilistic philosophy, whether encoded in the laws and rituals of a cult or casually followed in a hedonistic lifestyle. A strange paradox of materialism occurred as a result of the Gnostic denial of any spiritual value in the natural world. A sterile physical model was gradually built through the philosophies of Aquinas, Descartes, Spinoza, and forward into the Enlightenment. And as the spiritually dead physical world became a dispassionate subject of the intellectual mind, mechanistic explanations took root and made nature not the mother of all things, but the slave of intelligent will. Nature was no longer feared, but now it was rapaciously exploited. No gratitude or guilt for this exploitation was necessary, for nature was defamed as having no inherent soul, beauty, nor goodness within it, and Hobbesian cynicism was easily rationalized. Nature, the source of life, was effectively dead, and mentation provided the only reality. Even the essential and intuitive feeling of nature's reality was challenged by the empiricists, by the assertion that the tabula rasa of the mind defied any creative claim of biological nature. It was not until Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason proved an inherent structure in the rational mind in accordance with natural order that the trend towards complete denial of reality was slowed, though many refused to heed Kant's proofs. Also influential was Francois Quesnay's economic table a few decades earlier, which reinterpreted Confucianism into the economic and philosophical system he dubbed physiocracy. But the momentum was much too strong for Quesnay, Kant, and others. The denaturation swept like a giant wave over society with the American and French revolutions, fueled by a fantastically wealthy oligarchy, eager to replace kings and queens who were still dependent upon notions of divinely ordained hierarchy. The crass mentality of nullifying equality, materialism, liberalism, and egotism, all existing outside any ecological obligation or natural cohesiveness, presented new means of control more suited to the rich. Practices of mental servitude had had centuries to ingrain in the culture and evolve technically, just as propaganda derives from the Congregatio de Propaganda de Fide, a Catholic body to spread the religion. Identical and improved methods were put into place in the service of the now nature-annihilating philosophy. In the 18th century, a massive conspiracy unfolded across Europe and the New World as the Enlightenment ideologues sought to destroy the monarchy, church, and hearth, replacing these with an atheistic, materialistic culture inflamed with the revolutionary creeds of liberty, equality, and fraternity. It was by these revolutionary values that both the French and American revolutions took place, instrumented by many of the same extremely well-funded and devious conspirators, having cloaked their revolutionary aims within the lodges of the Freemasons, an occult society patterned after Kabbalism, and with such strict top-down secrecy that it could not be better engineered for rule by a hidden hand. A tremendous coup had taken place, not from an authentic change in popular sentiment, but from a very well orchestrated and financed conspiracy by the new merchant aristocracy against the old controlling elites. As the monarchy fell in France and the colonies, and loans were desperately needed, Jews maneuvered into control of many national banks. This would allow the Rothschilds to profit so wildly in the years ahead that they owned more than half the entire world's wealth in the 19th century, well before their most ambitious conspiracy at the beginning of the 20th. Red pill number 11. The United States of America is a massive fraud. No country more wholly embodies the Enlightenment propaganda than the United States. Even until the 1940s, the United States was seen by the European world powers as a rural, unimportant, and fairly impotent, if resource-rich province. Far more significant to Europe was the revolution in France, but the ancient heritage of land and culture, despite successive weakening through war and monarchical abuse, created perennial resistance to the Enlightenment culture reshaping. Robespierre's reign of terror could not crush the French spirit, though it certainly suppressed it, and old societal instincts kept fighting back. Conversely, the United States had no long-standing cultural history, no ancient coupling of blood and soil, and no real claim of ownership by the European immigrants who spread slowly over its land. Protests by nativists were not rooted in true identity with a homeland, but simple finders-keepers defensiveness. Nearly all who arrived on its shores were driven there by opportunism or desperation, and often both. The United States was effectively the biggest gold rush in Western history, a giant oil strike that promised easy wealth to every hungry, ambitious, and ruthless adventurer. The premise of revolution was freedom from taxation, less accountability, and unbridled individual interest. In exchange for unseating the old hierarchy, the plutocrats promised every citizen a share in the beckoning wealth of the New World. The old aristocratic rulers were corrupt more often than not, but they still provided stability and accountability. Over generations, many customs and protocols became normalized to both encourage the development of responsible aristocracy and limit the damage errant rulers could inflict. A king was an individual, a human who had often been raised to have a distinct sense of cultural identity with his people and land. It was an imperfect system, but one which could readily be rectified through a good ruler. Replacing that system was democracy, which guarantees the rule of the herd mentality. Outside of the highly refined democracies of Athens and the Senate, democracy had previously been fairly dangerous, as mobs can be capricious and unpredictable, bolting towards the first yell of lynch him or run. To give the masses self-rule was widely seen as irresponsible and hurtful to the populace, even more so than to the aristocracy. But the art of propaganda, built on centuries of religious indoctrination, had developed greatly with the press and progressive Enlightenment reforms. From secret societies to school primers to daily journals, fresh methods were available that allowed for unprecedented control of the thoughts and actions of the masses. The press formed the linchpin of this new strategy, and it's no mystery that Brother Franklin was a newsman. Through the influence of the press and other outlets, the wealthiest plutocrats were able to efficiently direct the beliefs and behaviors of the masses. The nature of democracy ensures that the critical dissenting view, no matter how correct, will never triumph as long as the majority may be swayed, which is remarkably easy to do. Unlike a bribed king, the masses never get indignant and refuse to collaborate. Skillfully indulged, they tirelessly follow the lead, even when it directly conflicts with the reality around them. Only the most aggressive intrusion of truth will convince them to act other than persuaded, and then only after a sufficient number of their peers are likewise alarmed. The real core American value that is enshrined in its Constitution and founding history is selfishness, while the essence of modern democracy is a personal bribe. Modern democracy guarantees invisible rule by the wealthy, not only over policy, but over the thoughts, habits, and preferences of the masses. And the few instances of populations resisting the will of these plutocrats have been invariably met with the same crushing oppression that belies the soporific claim of self-rule, as we see with the war between states, federal imposition, election fraud, political collusion, judicial legislation, and other examples. The United States is a morally void, imaginary construct that inverts virtue and suppresses real societal connection. But because America is not built upon the natural foundations of land-linked culture, it will always be impotent to throw off the yoke of this intellectual trap until it implodes of its own corruption. Red pill number 12. White nationalism is a ridiculous concept. As a result of the United States' culturally devoid concept of nationalism, an idea has arisen among the far right that hopes to cure the United States of its ills, white nationalism. In most European countries, nationalism quite naturally entails a return to the ancient cultural and ethnic identity or identities of times past. But Americans, because they have always been in denial of the importance of historical claim, having shamelessly swindled and stolen its land from the indigenous occupants, imagine some kind of composite cultural European identity and pretend this can be a national basis. America, in addition to the centuries-old presence of West Africans and Native Americans, is English, German, Irish, Scottish, Scandinavian, French, Dutch, Italian, Polish, Jewish, as well as dozens of smaller European constituents, plus Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, and so on. Let's imagine that all of Europe just dissolved her national borders and forced its people to integrate among each other. How well would that go? As encompassing as any cultural artifact, religion, even down to the same sect, has not been able to bridge the divide between nearby cultures. Ethnic similarity has certainly not been a guarantee either, as amply shown in Western Europe. The only way such integration could take place is by completely abandoning the specific cultural heritage of each individual in society, then re-identifying with some pan-European pseudo-culture. What would this new culture be based on? It couldn't be based on real history, real ethnic heritage, and real connection. Is it even really possible? Or would these new Europeans just be orphan drifters, clinging zealously onto ontological tenets as replacements for real natural culture? That stupidity is exactly what makes America the giant falsehood that it is today. The ease of integration between two cultures is directly correlated to their pre-existing similarity. People of dramatically different cultures cannot truly integrate, but must segregate, whether entirely or piecewise through patchwork hybridization. It is easy to underestimate the power of cultural difference, especially from an American perspective. As with genes, we are all 100% full of our individual culture. In order to integrate with another culture, we must dispense to some degree with our own, such as by thoroughly embracing a host culture. We cannot simply mix both cultures and retain their integrity any more than a single glass can hold 2 full glasses worth of water, or a child could inherit all the DNA from both parents. White nationalism is a foolish concept that reflects exactly the opposite of what European Americans should seek, which is a rediscovery and preservation of their personal heritage and culture. Red pill number 13. The New World Order is actually Jewish-funded white supremacy. If you want to understand modern times, you simply need to understand the origin of World War I, with the answers readily found in Quigley, Barnes, Fay, and others. The elite Jewish families provided the wealth and cunning, while the Anglo-American white supremacists provided the muscle and leadership. It was the old universal imperialism of Rome all over again and larger than ever before. Rothschilds, Rhodes, Milner, Balfour, Churchill, Wilson, Rockefeller, Schiff, and others conspired together to grab complete global power. Through their efforts, they ensured the end of the culturally progressive Ottoman Empire, which had provided peace in the Middle East, the beginning of the world government, and the deliberate collusion with and control of communism by the arch-capitalists of the world. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by a small group of radical youths who were directed and supplied by Freemasons should not in itself have set off the largest war in history to that time. Yet, after one mysterious failure of de-escalation after another, well documented by Quigley and others, the conflict did just that, leaving over 15 million people dead and the countries in Europe tossed about like pawns on a chessboard. The war was key to ensuring that the Tsarist Russian Empire, vigilant against usurpers and previously the target of multiple failed revolutions, was to become the radical vanguard of the Bolsheviks, whose leadership contained more than 90% Jews, including Lenin and Trotsky. This could not have been achieved without the limitless resources of the Bolsheviks' Rothschild backers, and particularly the instrumentations of their incomparable scion, Jacob Schiff, who had previously weakened the Russian Empire by financing Japan during the Russo-Japanese War. Immediately after the Bolsheviks gained control, Schiff would vigorously fund the communists, even as the Red Terror, a counter-revolutionary purging by the Bolshevik Emergency Committee, mercilessly killed over 1 million Russians over the period of about a month. Consider that the much-publicized Russian pogroms against Jews had killed, by Jewish estimates, no more than 3,000 at that time. Yet the Red Terror, the first of many large-scale deaths propagated by communism, remains largely forgotten. With Russia overthrown and England, the United States, and France already firmly under the control of the plutocratic interests, the principal prize remaining was the German Empire. The American people, largely accustomed to isolationism, especially in matters of war, had been loath to enter into the European conflict. Conspiring to drag his country into the war, President Woodrow Wilson worked with British and American propagandists to demonize Germans, such as through the fictitious accounts of brutal cruelty in Belgium. This failing to convince the American Congress to enter war, the Lusitania ruse was concocted, yet still fell short. After many similar calculated provocations, Wilson was finally able to elicit entry into the war, albeit in a limited capacity, becoming a so-called associate power. At the Paris Peace Conference ending the war, Wilson was instrumental in founding the League of Nations, a mechanism for world government. Wilson's efforts were rewarded that year with the famous propaganda instrument, the Nobel Peace Prize. A global guarantor of peace merely requiring the obedience to a supranational cabal, the League of Nations soon swelled with member nations pledging obedience to its covenant and the promise of world peace. But the global dominance that seemed imminent was stalled. The American representatives in Congress, still fiercely isolationist, prevented the United States from joining the League of Nations by a 49-35 Senate vote. Unlike Europe, the United States had been practically unscathed by the war and possessed no desperation for peace or security. In the years to come, this would be rectified. Red Pill number 14. World War II simply finished what World War I started. The post-war years in many European countries led to such corruption and exploitation that a reaction set in, not unlike the conditions prior to the Bourbon Restoration that followed the Revolution in France. While the worst events were to be found in the violent repression of the communists and culminated in the Holodomor and the Great Purge, the economic exploitation and moral degeneracy was nowhere as grotesque as in the German Weimar Republic, potentiated by the usurious Treaty of Versailles. These conditions led to popular support for the German National Socialists, who directly stood against globalist control and sought to restore the pre-war German dignity. The National Socialists, of course, became the most famous and powerful example of resistance to the New World Government, leading the Axis powers against the capitalist Communist alliance. And for this, they became the most reviled enemy possible, the object of the world's largest, longest-lasting, and most spiteful propaganda campaign. They would become the modern Amalekites, generations of their descendants punished with bloodthirsty viciousness. The rebellion of the Germans, Italians, and Japanese show the efforts at world conquest were not yet successfully completed. Successful, yes, but not complete. The limitations and mistakes of the past effort would need to be remedied, the newly acquired power put to productive use, and more permanent and total control established. And to secure desperation for an authority providing world peace, the world would need to remain forever frightened, terrorized from standing up. To shock the United States out of its comfortable self-sufficiency and related isolationism, the Great Depression was engineered by the banking industry and greatly exacerbated by the Federal Reserve, established by Woodrow Wilson soon after his election. The Great Depression, occurring during the presidency of the committed isolationist Herbert Hoover, provided the pretext for sweeping government social and economic control, establishing the perceived need for government protection rather than the traditional American self-reliance. A Freemason from an extremely wealthy family, Franklin Roosevelt became president as the economy hit bottom, saving the country with the New Deal reforms and fully securing American subservience to the globalist agenda. In less than a year after being elected, Roosevelt would officially recognize the Soviet Union, granting legitimacy to a regime that had been condemned by prior presidents. Roosevelt's support would reach its apex through the direction of Harry Hopkins, who illegally channeled hundreds of billions in cash, resources, and classified information to the Soviets even prior to the United States joining the war. It is logical to wonder why arch-capitalists, lavishly enriched through usury, monopoly, and oligarchy, would seek to aid countries with communist ideologies that seek to smash capitalism. If we are to believe Marx, capitalism and communism are antithetical philosophies fundamentally opposed to each other. Why would they collude together against the Axis, and what synthesis is predicated? We must understand that both economic systems are designed to appeal fundamentally to selfish materialistic interest, either that of the haves or the have-nots, as capitalism and communism unduly rewards the possession or lack of resources, respectively. Both are packaged in the naturalistic garb of rationalism, claiming to reflect either a Hobbesian game of fitness or the Marxian dialectical progress toward the perfect society. Thus, materialistic ambition, marketed respectively towards the dominant or disenfranchised, is justified as superior to spiritual goals which are seen as irrational, unjust, and unhealthy. These spiritual inclinations being unnatural according to materialistic philosophy, they are presented as inevitably destined to be weeded out through the unseen hand or the will of the proletariat. Both capitalism and communism are reflections of the same underlying materialistic philosophy of the modernism, expressed for different audiences. The conflict between these is the conflict of competitors playing at the same sport, competing for the same gilded prize. It is simply a translation of the conflict of those ambitious kings whose wars had been financed and much profited from by moneylenders. But the lender has little power over content people, and so ambitions must be nurtured, grievances aggravated, and fears stoked, and thereby is the causus belli invented. As two systems promising endless socio-economic ambition, capitalism and communism are thus highly desirable. The divinely ordained monarchies and capitalist Gentile families had even more interest in control and power than the Jews who funded them. The Catholic Church formed, as we have seen, the original New World Order, every bit as liberal and nature-denying as later humanism. Protestantism, by reverting to the Roman influence but keeping the Jewish root, became extremely materialistic and power-hungry, as Max Müller observed. While the modern Jewish trend was towards reform and relaxation of the most stringent and unreasonable tenets of Judaism, Protestantism took a distinct turn back towards the literalism and extremism of zealots. But, while the Jews were never a fearsome warrior tribe, despite the co-opted myths of their texts, the Germanic Christians were extremely warlike and would channel the Yahwistic zeal into unprecedented violence. However dangerous Jewish skullduggery or Gentile warmongering were by themselves, the alliance between them was a catalyzed destructive force that allowed for true world conquest. The two groups had conspired together to control the entire world in their Yahweh-sanctioned madness, the Jewish money powers and the Anglo-Saxon ruling class. The writing of the Anglo-American elites involved make clear the intention of global white supremacy, the white man's burden for the good of the world. How ironic that the global elites who hide behind the gospel of liberalism and equality were actually a conglomerate of Protestant white supremacists and Jewish magnates, both the most loyal devotees of the Old Testament God. Soon, the long-enfeebled Catholic Church, guilty of much the same hundreds of years before, was brought into the game as well, made official through the Second Vatican Council. And so, the true enemy of both communism and capitalism was the economically independent, proudly Nordic, and defiantly racially inclined NASDAP of Germany. The threat was not that the National Socialists would wage war on or exterminate the Jews. In fact, the National Socialists were crucial in the establishment of a Zionist homeland, encouraging immigration to Palestine through the Havurah Transfer Agreement. The danger was the example of Germany, a self-sufficient, independent nation, and an astounding success once unburdened by global parasitism. Germany could not be permitted to survive and upset the great game at play. As Theodor Kaufmann would write, Germany must perish. And thusly did World War II come to pass, beginning with the Soviet hammer of the East. The many overtures of peace that Adolf Hitler made to England would fall on deaf ears, for peace was the enemy. Roosevelt ensured the Pearl Harbor attack, correctly anticipating that the outcome would allow full entry into war against the Axis, and thereby Germany, which he constantly stretched to engage. Many events transpired, tens of millions died, and by the time the war was over, the stage was set. The Germans were vilified beyond any previous measure. The Nuremberg trials would announce to the world that the National Socialists were guilty of terrible war crimes, most notably the attempted mass genocide of the Jews. When thus accused, every single German leader fully denied the charges, except Albert Speer, who instead claimed total ignorance of any war crimes. History has waited patiently for the smoking gun, proving that the NASDAP leadership knew of the death camps rebuilt by the Soviets. Yet, despite the countless records of a scrupulously documented government, and even such recent items as Alfred Rosenberg's private diary, no such evidence exists. The trial was presided over by the very judge who sent hundreds of thousands to their death in Stalin's show trials, with the Germans prevented from presenting any evidence of their own, and was restricted in scope solely to war crimes by the Germans, thus ignoring the numerous war crimes of both the Americans and the Russians. In truth, this Siegerjustiz trial was precisely the same sort as was perfected in the Great Purge, with the charges and punishment predefined and unavoidable. It is no wonder that the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court at the time called the trials a fraud. Yet this trial is still held as irrefutable proof of the National Socialists' guilt. Indeed, just questioning the verdict is punishable by years of jail time in dozens of free countries. A thorough refutation of the Holocaust propaganda is an exhaustive, though readily achievable task in itself, but there is one question that we can answer presently. Is it not, at the least, possible that the Allied powers would invent, propagate, and ruthlessly defend the Holocaust in order to besmirch the National Socialists? Did the communists not prove themselves from Katyn to Solovki, to Mitroikin, to Venona, from the tens of millions that died in counter-revolutionary purges, from the countless re-educated millions, from the explicit instructions of Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, and other Soviet leaders to lie, cheat, and betray for the revolution, that they were capable of such a lie? Did the British and American governments not unabashedly publish black atrocity propaganda against the Germans throughout World War I, propaganda which is now universally understood to be false? Only a few years ago, it became public knowledge, though rarely repeated, that the claim that the National Socialists killed 5 million Gentiles, in addition to 6 million Jews in death camps, was a complete fabrication invented by reputed Holocaust experts to garner additional political clout. Yet how many books and websites still repeat the now admitted falsehood that 11 million died in the Holocaust? How many provide authoritative explanations proving this 11 million figure correct and refuting any denial of its veracity? But nonetheless, questioning the claim of 6 million genocided Jews remains the most vilified intellectual taboo in the Western world. Red Pill number 15. The globalist society was put into place through psychological terrorism. After the war, the German people were raped, robbed, and re-educated. While Eastern Germany was an oppressive prison, Western Germany became captive to new techniques of social conditioning. Donald Cameron, president of the American and World Psychiatric Associations, had prior to the Nuremberg trials developed a complete plan for the transformation of the German people. Cameron would, after the Morgenthau Plan had set the stage, see his own plan realized under Germany's reconstruction. Along with Theodor Adorno, Hannah Arendt, Wilhelm Reich, and other experts, Cameron diagnosed the Aryan nationalism of the Germans as clinically pathological. These authorities, building on Freud's rationalistic revision of spirituality and mind, defined the Germans' key neurosis as anti-Semitism. For the cure, Cameron and his colleagues instrumented a massive apparatus of education, propaganda, and legal restrictions to condition the German population against ever rising from their knees. In the preparation for World War II, Roosevelt had collected and extended the many wartime propaganda organizations of World War I under the focused direction of the new Office of Strategic Services, which would become the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA. The CIA is, in fact, purely a propaganda organization, and has been from its very onset, one that exists outside of any legal constraint. As a powerful outlet for the global interests, the CIA would implement hundreds of illegal and unethical propaganda operations. A decade after the war, Cameron would become key in one such plot, the behavioral modification programs of MKUltra. Heading McGill University Psychiatric Hospital, Cameron forcibly drugged, electroshocked, and tortured patients for months in order to brainwash them and develop mind control methods to drive their actions, finding effective techniques now routinely used by the CIA on interrogated prisoners. The completely involuntary patients, who had checked in for minor issues such as postpartum depression, were permanently scarred by their experiences. The CIA funded and directed this research along with the more famous LSD research, eventually supplying hundreds of millions of doses of psychedelic drugs to drug users in the United States as one of several societal destabilization methods it used during the turbulent 60s. The second major planned outcome of World War II was the establishment of the United Nations. Where the League of Nations failed, the UN succeeded, creating the visible government institution for the New World Order. The terror of the Universal War, which this time disturbed every nation and people, left the world pleading for peace. The UN promised this peace and cemented the United States and the Soviet Union together as members in the global plan. Though it is little known, this same UN is now the most important public organization in the world, as we will see. This binding of the capitalists and communists would be key for the third major planned outcome, the Cold War. Back in 1913, H.G. Wells wrote The World Set Free, where atomic weapons and their mutually assured destruction force all nations into a world government that is the promise of peace. A close ally of the elite, his books almost always advertised the promise of a future world government. At the end of the war, the bomb was revealed. A secretive cabal of elect scientists and administrators had supposedly developed a weapon that would only be used militarily once in the more than 70 years since its unveiling. Massive propaganda insisted for the next several decades that the weapon was absolutely terrifying. Not only was it massively destructive in the instant of detonation, but it salted the earth and became the destroyer of worlds. Only the United Nations could ensure the always tense negotiations necessary to avert World War III, the apocalypse. Following Nagasaki and Hiroshima, the propaganda around future war became unimaginably terrifying. But in February 1946, de Seversky, consultant of the United States government on the damage in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, reported that the damage was no more destructive than that of conventional firebombing as in Tokyo. The nuclear weapons were apparently being grossly exaggerated in their destructive capability. Nuclear weapons had demonstrated only a very limited effectiveness and could be readily survived if you were not unlucky enough to be within a couple miles of the blast radius. In fact, considerable evidence exists that nuclear weapons simply don't exist at all, having always been a propaganda device. What is certain is that they are not significantly more powerful than conventional weapons, and were deliberately used to terrify the post-war world into global mediation. Winston Churchill almost immediately began raising the alarm of the new conflict between the two world powers, and a subterranean battle emerged that still permitted the world's wealth to be rebuilt. The Cold War created an ideal environment for enrichment and gaining power, pitting the free world against the international revolution. Proxy wars kept the frightening reality of armed conflict always in our minds, but yet also remote. Thus, we would never feel secure, yet never truly secure ourselves. No matter how obvious the solution was to the Pattons or MacArthurs of the world, the threat would never be allowed to end. The peace was simply suspended terror. And the most terrifying outcome of all, nuclear Armageddon, was always looming, always prompting towards global solutions. So the years marched on, and the world progressively alienated from its traditional philosophies through intentional conditioning by the educational system, press, religious institutions, government programs of many sorts, and soulless corporate collusion. European tribal pride was inverted, and white guilt became the new identity, leading to a deep self-loathing that was much worse than being considered innately lazy, impulsive, or foolish. In the new narrative, Europeans were the most evil race in history, and all whites were born with an unpayable moral debt to the rest of the world. Desperate whites sought to destroy the stain of their ancestors through miscegenation, prejudicial handicaps, and the angry disavowal of their heritage. The twisted psychological conditioning program of humiliation, guilt, and obligation used to spiritually sterilize the Germans was implemented throughout the Western world. For, as we've been told, weren't we all just a few bigoted expressions from becoming Nazis ourselves? And so a racial and cultural genocide was taking place, a dehumanization by which the beliefs, traditions, and identities of the European people were corrected. As Marx, Engels, and countless later radicals noted, the family was the root of the oppressive hierarchical pattern. As the transmission belt for the traditional culture and the antidote by way of love to propaganda against ancestral history, the family was the arch enemy. From compulsory public education to materialistic seduction of the adolescent to expert-sanctioned encouragement of rebellion and hostility against parents, the conditioning forces directed a large and multifaceted campaign against the family. While men provide the physical and intellectual defense of a culture, it is women who are the most crucial guardians, nurturing each new generation, instilling with them a sense of love, identity, pride, and values. In fact, the old naturalistic philosophy is fully embodied in a mother's love, the generosity and sacrifice of material concerns for the spiritual value of life. Family love is the fundament of the spirit, the pillar upon which all our cultural goodness was built, and this magnificent love is still where hope remains. Thus, maternity was brought under attack by the reformers from the beginning. Feminism, which in its zealous hatred of the feminine role, was more misogynistic than the coarsest panderer, attacked marriage, child-rearing, and even heterosexuality as vile injustices. Children were torn from their mothers, the hearth was violated, and women were marched towards the materialistic ideology as abject toilers. No longer would family reflect, through the mother and the father's actions, the love, care, and centrality of their children and marriage. Family became known as a mere and presumed exploitative economic partnership. Birth rates dropped, fidelity was an outmoded irrationality, and sexual intimacy was stripped down to only its material basis. Abortion, homosexuality, pornography, drug use, in which spiritual and emotional states are reduced to physical manipulations, and childless existence became first tolerated, then accepted, and finally encouraged as symbolic rebellions against the spiritual life. Generations of children were raised without any real family. Their would-be parents living in perpetual immaturity, unable or unwilling to place their sacred parental responsibility over selfish material interests. In the meantime, a complete takeover of the Western financial world took place, encroaching far beyond the banking industry and into personal microeconomics. The goal, besides direct consolidation and enrichment, was preventing independence from the global economic network being established. Taxation invaded every aspect of financial action, repeated transaction after transaction as the efforts of workers were confiscated into the system. This system would then dispense services and goods formerly provided by communities and families themselves, creating a vampiric dependence. Real resources disappeared in exchange for worthless currency, and now even the currency is just ephemeral electronic data. This fictionalization of wealth retention was complemented by ever more inscrutably complex financial instruments, allowing the grossest of fraudulent and usurious schemes. Debt, personal and governmental, would become necessary for commonplace goals, as real personal wealth evaporated and financial dependence was encouraged at every turn. Much of this debt was never expected to be repaid, but it was immeasurably useful and profitable as it served to shackle and entangle the debtor. While the financial seizure transpired and post-war generations were increasingly subjected to social conditioning, the threat of war with the communists allowed both a vanguard for revolutionary incursion into the culture and a powerful motivator toward global authority. But to further shift to true global rule, the status quo of national identity would need to be disrupted. National resource independence would need to be crushed and self-sufficiency sent to the grave. Although the nebulous international communist movement provided a form of global endangerment, in practice it dissolved largely into national conflicts. These conflicts occasionally had the undesired side effect, through protective measures, of strengthening national identity and independence. And, as the Western world increasingly adopted the communist policies they had posed against, a new threat would be needed that would more fully transgress national and cultural barriers while still allowing materialistic corruption. Moving toward these ends, the racial and cultural identity providing national strength was undermined through revision of immigration policies. While it would take generations for the demographic shifts to fully impact society, this later effect would perfectly coincide with other future plans. Likewise, a long-term socioeconomic undermining would have its origin in these tumultuous times, with the introduction of free trade. Two of the most powerful visible implementers of the conspiracy, Henry Kissinger and David Rockefeller, ushered in a new age of economic globalization. From propping up communist countries in exchange for slave labor to the machinations of the global oil banking complex, free trade began its great erosion of Western productivity, independence, and integrity. The economic interactions established through free trade would lead to greatly strengthened supranational institutions, such as through the World Trade Organization, or WTO. By effectively reintroducing slavery in the form of desperate Third World workers and forcing First World countries to compete with these slaves, new wealth would be generated completely independent of the troublesome middle class. This process, with the aid of the Western banks and politicians, would vastly enlarge the welfare class in the Western world, as the number of competitive skills rapidly shrunk, shuffling more and more previously independent families into dependence on the colluding governments. Under the guidance of the globalists, the Soviet Union was purposefully dissolved, China practiced an exploitative capitalism, and the national holdouts of economic independence were toppled through intrigue and war. As the first fully conditioned generation of the West, the baby boomers started to ascend into power. 1,000 revolutionary fractures in society rift apart our common racial, spiritual, and social identity, creating a cultural civil war that was persisted and empowered by divisive propaganda and politics. Thousands of books have been written, some with congratulation and some with consternation, cataloging the myriad forms by which the materialistic ideology has in recent times affected our culture. Their details are not unimportant, but neither are they truly useful. For in the enervating internal conflict of the West, the leaders on the right and left have remained entirely controlled, including the fringes such as the alt-right and Black Lives Matter, just as was the case earlier with the John Birch Society and Students for a Democratic Society. As our history approaches the present, we see the tremendous demographic crisis of immigration, a Western workforce hollowed out by free trade and entitlement, widespread spiritual and cultural collapse, and the growing centralization of governing power. But now that the specter of nuclear annihilation is largely past, what horror will cause the new Western generations, the vast majority of which having had no direct exposure to war, to shelter under the mordant arms of the United Nations? Islam is the closest cousin of Judaism, and the Arab the nearest racial kin of the Israeli. But it is not the language that binds these so closely, though Hebrew and Arabic are vastly similar Semitic languages without relation to the Indo-European fountainhead. In truth, Islam, even more than the cosmopolitan Judeo-Roman creation Christianity, is descended directly from Judaism and the ancient Canaanite archetypes. Islam, precisely like Judaism, is a religion based on extensive codes of strict behavioral laws. Its purely materialistic ideology is reflected in the fact that followers' inner sentiments and beliefs do not matter. What matters is complete submission in physical behavior. The Muslim afterlife Jannah, as with the Jews, is restricted to a materialistic paradise, rewarding obedience to the Islamic commandments, or ahkam. Abraham, the first and founding Jew, is also considered the first and perfect Muslim. Only Moses features with equal prominence in both the Judaic and Islamic canons. But while the Jews were strictly delineated by racial heritage, Muhammad, informed by Christian universalism, removed the requirements of genetic lineage, and thus united the warring tribes of Arabia under a new cult. Instead of conquering with scheming and manipulation as the Jews had done, the barbarian raiders of Arabia would conquer by the sword. The spoils of this rapacious conquest, available to any Ghazi that would submit to the Islamic code, Islam grew rapidly and violently. There is no major historical hostility between the Jews and Muslims, contrary to the impression created by the modern Middle Eastern provocations of Israel. Provocations useful, of course, in sustaining vigilance against anti-Semitism. In truth, as with the Christians, Jews, and other groups, the Muslims are seen by the oligarchs as just another pawn to be used in their quest for power. As the gates of the West are held open for the Islamic masses to invade and anti-Western sentiment is stoked in Third World terrorist enclaves, who stands behind both the invitation and the provocation? Who would stand to benefit from the subversion and the new Cold War of jihad? The project for the new American century promised to help bring about a new international order for the advancement of economic freedom and peace, instrumenting the September 11th bombings and regime change in the Middle East. In doing so, they not only attacked the few national banks not under their control, but also through the CIA and its intermediaries such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS, engineered a vast immigration invasion of Europe from Iraq, Palestine, Afghanistan, Syria, and Somalia. But the culture war with the Muslims, the replacement for the communists, was only one half of the modern formula of fear. As was needed to drive the panicked masses to the slaughterhouse, a new thunderhead was claimed to threaten the complete death of the earth, replacing the now highly abstract danger of nuclear destruction. Eventually, evolving the earlier claims of world overpopulation, global cooling, and global warming, this monster was finally dubbed climate change and would become a tremendous impetus for global change in the present. Red pill number 16. The future is decay and decline, not sudden crash. We are now at the precipice of tremendous global change. Generations of people have been raised with the conditioning environment to prepare them to accept and even welcome this time. We face a terrible evil, and there is little hope for change in the near term. We are about to see the Leviathan, having for centuries swollen the deep and corroded our walls, burst forth and drown its enemies. The United Nations met in 2015 to secure international commitment to its plan for the next 15 years. By its own description, what the UN plans is of completely unprecedented scope and importance in establishing global governance. The effort to propagandize and accomplish the agenda of this plan forms the largest open conspiracy in human history, involving nearly every major governmental, charitable, and religious organization in the world. The program is based around 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which are 1. End poverty in all its forms everywhere. 2. End hunger, achieve food security and improve nutrition and promote sustainable agriculture. 3. Ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. 4. Ensure inclusive and quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. 5. Achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. 6. Ensure access to water and sanitation for all. 7. Ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. 8. Promote inclusive and sustainable economic growth, employment, and decent work for all. 9. Build resilient infrastructure, promote sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. 10. Reduce inequality within and among countries. 11. Make cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. 12. Ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. 13. Take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. 14. Conserve and sustainably use the ocean, seas, and marine resources. 15. Sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, halt and reverse land degradation, halt biodiversity loss. 16. Promote just, peaceful, and inclusive societies. 17. Revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. The goals were all adopted, and all major nations committed to their implementation, despite the estimated annual 5% of gross national product required of developed countries for their implementation. The press coverage was very small, and there was almost no visible controversy. There will be next to no immediate effects, and the apparent importance of the summit itself will vanish for all but the carefully observant. Even as direct outcomes appear, their connection to the plan will be mostly ignored, silently subsumed into the agenda of organizations like Global Citizen and national governments. The goals will appeal to the vast majority of people, describing a utopian future well aligned with the supposed benefits of both capitalism and communism. The post-scarcity world will beckon people of all nations. No one, some will think, can morally be against these goals, just as no one can be against world peace. And, just as such material promises have led blindly the masses again and again for hundreds of years past, so will they in the years ahead. The promoters and advocates of these changes will almost universally believe in their goals' inherent correctness. Their motivations will be honest, their passion authentic, and their defense vigorous. An organization widely believed to be benevolent and representative, the United Nations doesn't need to transcend or excuse past misdeeds. But even after the mass murders of the Soviet Union and the economic and social abuses of unrestrained capitalism were known, they found no shortage of defenders and apologists. How much more zealous will the proponents of the United Nations be? But what will really happen as a result of this agenda? Will the goals be achieved? If so, at what cost and in what form shall be the result? And who shall describe the path these goals shall take? Who shall measure their success or failure? In order to reach the post-scarcity vision the communists promised, a penultimate period was necessary in which a dictatorship of the proletariat would rule to steer to the desired outcome. In practice, this would be the bloodthirsty rule of the communist elites, causing the deaths of over 100 million people under their perfectly democratic rule. And yet, even this grim outcome is more benign than what awaits us with the New World Order. In order to accomplish and enforce the agenda, there will be a massive expansion of the United Nations' purview and authority. The national financial obligations alone will vastly increase the power of the UN, just as Woodrow Wilson's addition of a federal income tax predicated the United States' dramatic transformation from state to federal rule. Due to the extremely encompassing goals of the new agenda, far broader in fact than the charters or constitutions of most nations, the power that will be exacted shall truly make for an all-powerful world government with all nations kneeling below it. The goals themselves shall universally spread the materialistic ideology and all of its attendant woes, which we have already examined, such as through its guarantees of equality. And while the danger described so far is serious, continuing and enlarging the problems and suffering the utopian materialistic ideology causes, the goals hide a deliberate and much greater ultimate outcome. Climate change provides the apocalyptic fear and urgency within the summit, and many of the goals will apply the concepts of sustainability and intersectionality to extend environmental protection to total socioeconomic control. Climate change is a scientific propaganda campaign that seeks to terrorize the public into compliance with a green technology racket that will replace use of primitive resources such as wood and methane with dependence on more advanced products such as GMOs, batteries, and solar cells, despite their far more environmentally dangerous manufacturing and waste implications. Due to the completely benign gas, CO2, being targeted for control, almost every aspect of energy use comes under the hand of these supposed environmentalists. Numerous examples of falsifying evidence have been proven, the hockey stick graph being but one such instance of scientific fraud. These frauds continually push towards a predetermined outcome, and contrary evidence is deliberately ignored. This intended scientific outcome is clear when one examines the IPCC's famous climate reports, which in presenting its lengthy lists of the effects of unchecked climate change invariably present one terrifying result after another. Are we truly to believe that a global pattern of warming, cooling, desertification, humidification, etc. would have no positive effects at all? And so ridiculous has the charade become that every unpleasant weather occurrence is explained as a result of human-caused climate change: hurricanes, forest fires, rainstorms, drought, and even earthquakes. But it is equal folly to imagine that completely unrestrained global corporations would not rape the earth, or that restrictions on pollutants and toxins have no reasonable basis. Yet, will the United Nations plan save us from a poisoned future? Or will it not encourage wasteful global transportation, endless consumption of technological trash, and a new universality of the fluoridated, medicated, vaccinated, and digitized global citizen? One only needs to look to the past consideration given to the environment by both communists and capitalists to understand how little is sacred to the materialistic mindset. Yet, the goals for climate change, for all their noise and falsehood, do not pose a major threat outside of the aforementioned creeping intersectionality and are principally a motivator. Instead, the gravest threat lurks elsewhere in the goals. This secret objective will cause hundreds of millions to die and the near destruction of the Western society as we know it. And this terrible tragedy will be ironically caused in combination with other factors of the global conspiracy by the most elemental humanitarian objectives of the agenda, attempting to end poverty, hunger, disease, and inequality. They are based, like the Abrahamic religions and secular humanism, on a fundamental misunderstanding of nature and health, including the absolute necessity of limit and death, the male spiritual power. They deny the historical proofs of every time, every culture, and every life, instead holding that progress will make the previously impossible possible. They elevate material contentment as the highest goal of life, and conversely material suffering as the worst evil. Clearly, the presented agenda, reflective of linear progressivism in general, embodies the bitter post-desertification ideology of materialism. The result of this grave misunderstanding, foretold in the tale of Ninhursag, would be tremendous loss through the following events. A great host of global aid organizations will receive a massive influx of capital and other resources to help developing nations, the governments of which they will partner with in exchange for these governments implementing globalist policies enslaving their people. This aid will come from developed nations, beginning the largest welfare scheme in the history of the world at a time when these first world countries have never been less self-sustaining. The aid will be used in two main ways. First, it will implement systems of global economic dependence in the third world countries under the Orwellian guise of sustainability. By introducing free trade, these impoverished people will become the slaves of the new global economy, wholly dependent upon external economic forces for their survival as their previous capacity for self-reliance is removed. Second, the aid will directly relieve some abject conditions in a temporary fashion, such as by supplying food shipments. However, this will only worsen these problems in the long term. For the problems the aid is to remedy are already almost invariably the products of a limited people having previously received similar artificial help. For example, almost all developing countries are overpopulated in the sense that their internally available resources are insufficient to sustain their own populations. If the resources are insufficient, why does the excessive portion of the population not, for example, starve, thus restoring the balance to resource production? The answer, of course, is because external aid supported the excess, prolonging and increasing the problem of overpopulation. How much more exacerbated shall these conditions become when every modern effort is undertaken to prevent any natural population correction? Should infant mortality be halved, should widespread free healthcare be available, what then will become of the world's hungry and poor? And as each population boom expands, these nations will have ever more entitled expectations to and need for welfare from first world countries, blaming their rescuers with justification for their predicament. The first world countries will be forced to muster more support, for as bad as it may get in Copenhagen, it surely will be worse in Nairobi. With each payment of the UN tax, the global administrative apparatus is enriched and enlarged, their corporate and NGO partners likewise grow, and the grand bureaucracy becomes more complex, established, and encroaching. This aid will fund not only overpopulation, but the financing of the free market slave class that will simultaneously destroy the first world economy. Billions of third world citizens will become the slaves of this new global economy, with booming growth in countries throughout Africa and Southern Asia. These people will be slaves not only through their labor, but through their participation as the long-tail consumers of the global economy, just as has already happened with mobile phones. Inexpensive computer communication technology will be commonplace in the third world, much like plastic containers are now. This will allow over 90% of the world's population to have internet access and electronic banking, as electronic transactions replace physical currency throughout the world. Through this technological infestation, the world's entire population will be conditioned with freely available education, robbed via usury and taxes, and readily organized into rabbles and armies through propaganda. Yet the Western masses will long be anesthetized from what is happening as frictionless technology, drugs, sexual degeneracy, and ever more extreme sensory experiences entrain the people from young to old. All privacy in urban areas will disappear, but more alarming, even the expectation of privacy will vanish as measures to track and levy all citizen behaviors expand via drones, sensors, and automation. Lifelong education will become a major pastime, driven by a looming sense of obsolescence and newly free educational resources, and serve as an even more strident form of social conditioning. In these first world countries, the crime rate, national debt, and culture wars will explode as vast waves of immigrants overrun communities, undermine job markets, and crash the national welfare systems. The combination of economic competition from free market slavery, greatly diminished actual purchasing power, and vastly expanded government assistance programs will push most of the middle class into poverty. But just the reverse will be widely believed, as the middle class will be redefined to include dependence on the government, enabling millions to escape poverty and join the new middle class. This first world economic collapse will happen by stages and be hidden through currency manipulations, just as has already begun. The national governments, greatly overburdened by their welfare systems and dwindling productivity, will become vastly dependent on the global welfare programs. The debt from these global loans and eventually other forms of aid will grow with such ease that few citizens will notice that their once proud country has become a fully dependent nation. For in terms of their self-sufficiency and independence, the developed nations have already collapsed. What remains now are already just ghosts of their former selves, illusions of nationhood. So will the world shift into the next phase through this vast but gentle leveling of the first and third worlds, removing the disparity between people just as promised, but in the form of making us all slaves to the global hegemony. But the population debt must eventually be paid, and it will be paid in blood. After the first world is reduced, there is no more use for excessive third world populations. They will have become only a burden to the global conspiracy, having outlived their usefulness. Massive deaths will inevitably occur, whether through desperate war, natural epidemics, or engineered extermination. A new era of population control will necessarily result, guided, of course, by the global government, which will help all of us to be good, productive, global citizens. The materialistic life will be all most global citizens will ever know, and there will be but one obscenely wealthy tribe ruling the world. Red pill number 17. Resistance is futile. Independence is not. The goal of the globalists is to make slaves of the world for their own material benefit. The truth is that they are not so intent on destruction as possession, and our physical lives will be in most cases comfortable enough. They can very easily create war and acute economic collapse in the West, but will only do so if they believe it is necessary to destroy resistance. It is unlikely that a traditional apocalyptic scenario will unfold in the West, though violent threats of the possibility will be regularly presented. To truly succeed at world domination, they must have mostly docile, intimidated, and basically content subjects, and they are aware of this. In fact, the world they are creating will be agreeable to many people. There is no real organized resistance to their plans. There is really nothing that an individual or group can do to change the slide into plutocratic world dominance. Armed rebellion would be tragically counterproductive and must be avoided for everyone's sake. The New World Order is our inescapable future. The new nationalist and populist leaders are puppets every bit as much as the internationalists who preceded them, whether willingly or otherwise. This includes Trump, Le Pen, Putin, Petri, and all other such politicians. All countries are now ruled by the wealthy. These plutocrats effectively control all of the wealth in the world, and the financial markets are 100% under their control. They can print money at will, seize accounts, inflate through fractional reserves, tax, levy, fine, and simply lie to invent whatever financial figures they want with zero real accountability. The few efforts to audit actual gold reserves, which are themselves a previous market preferred over silver and other commodities precisely because of the level of control a few elites could exercise over them, have shown that the claimed wealth in the Bank of England, Fort Knox, and elsewhere are unsubstantiated. And in the new economy, where wealth is a number stored in a computer database, any idea of financial independence is an illusion. Where hope remains is in the practical ability to be self-sufficient and independent through working the land, bartering, service exchange with neighbors, and so on. The genie that can never be put back in the bottle is awareness of history. The days of the Library of Alexandria burning are over, and access to the information is now effectively impossible to prevent. But that won't change the larger course of history, as the increased power, technology, and skill of the propagandists ensure that the majority will follow the Pied Piper wherever they want. Only the few, only those with the gift of wisdom, will understand these things. And some fewer of these must be ready to one day renew our civilization. Having secured their power over all nations, the rulers will descend into abhorrent immoderation. Their unchecked materialistic drive, their lust, greed, ambition, selfishness, and vanity, their unquenchable thirst for power and wealth, all finding destructive result. Focus solely on their material gain, without a love of their subjects or truly anyone but themselves, their cancer will grow to a lethal extreme. Those in their ranks who are shrewd enough to be moderate will be overrun, and the creeping exploitation will become so burdensome that a great reaction will build. An awakening will thunder across the world, joined by the greatest from all races and cultures, and the globalists will be thrown out. And when that happens, a new, naturally correct approach must be ready for the leaders of tomorrow. Red pill number 18, Confucianism is the way forward. Confucianism is a system of practical philosophy for individual and social existence in harmony with the way or Tao of the natural universe. The classical Chinese concept for this existence in harmony is without doing, or wu wei, meaning existence in perfect harmony with natural order, and hence not requiring any artificial effort or intention. While China was far from free of war and oppression, and Confucius lived in a time of considerable intrigue and upheaval, it was spared significant and long-lasting climatological change. This was coupled with a venerable tradition of preserving and respecting past golden ages and accumulated wisdom. This traditional wisdom, such as is contained in the classic of poetry, gave Confucius what he felt to be sufficient material to understand and act correctly, if the wisdom was properly revered and applied. Confucius was like a philosophical anthologist, collecting and ruminating on wisdom from long ago. In doing so, he and the similar but far more esoteric Lao Tzu would together be of extraordinary importance in China for thousands of years as they carried the light of the past wisdom on through the ages of strife and oppression. The essence of this wisdom is harmony with natural order. The popular dichotomy is between the nature-denying blind faith of religious fundamentalism or humanistic liberalism and the nature-denying scientistic sterility of mechanism. Yet the apparent differences of these poles pale in comparison to their true antipode, the unification of nature and divine order, the oneness of physical and spiritual reality. We need no longer be astray from the truths that were obvious to our ancestors, nor must we eremitically primitivize ourselves, trying inefficiently to glean the elements. Why blindfold ourselves or arrogantly imagine the ancient wisdom holds no value now? Confucius tapped into the ancient Eurasian spiritual truth. It is the proper heritage of civilization. After millennia of occultation, the light of the past has risen again from the east and illuminates the truth for any seekers to find. We should accept this treasured heirloom of our ancestors. But while we should certainly venerate and study the lost past, let us not limit ourselves to what was present then. A great world of thought and experience has expanded with human existence. Scientific observation in particular holds sublime value to the student of nature. Therefore, we should embrace both the ancient and the recent in creating the system of the future. It is recent science that has taught us today so clearly the historical effects of environmental crisis and so well proven the influence of ecology upon the organism. It is ancient wisdom that magnifies the importance of harmony with nature, that both humbles and ennobles mankind through our inseparable existence within the natural universe. Together they reflect the living essence of Confucianism, the eternal truth continually reborn as the unique now. A merciful return to sustainability is required for happy existence, just as Ninhursag decreed. Balance with nature must be maintained, with cyclical renewal clearly being the norm. Consumption and progress must be appropriately tempered with the realization that endless linear growth is cancerous and disharmonious. The egoistic desire for immortality must be challenged, for death and decay are elementally useful forces when in harmony with renewal and change. Even self must be re-examined in the light of personal unity with nature. Fertility must be returned to its rightful throne. It must be understood, preserved, and revered, as must be the life force of nature. The vital connection between life and land must be recognized. With much study, contemplation, and direct communion with the natural world, the realization of a healthy modern society can be fulfilled. The truth is that this society is ultimately inevitable, for it is the reality of existence. To fulfill our task, we must resume the ancient quest for Wu-Wei, the eternal wisdom of existing in perfect harmony with the Tao of nature. We must return to the love of maternity, to family, to ourselves, to the great tree of life, and thereby to the entire beautiful and divine natural world to which we belong. Thank you for watching the Red Pills Challenge. I hope it was helpful to you. If you found it interesting, please share it freely. This is Arthur Bliss, wishing you the very best.